Rick Rashid is one of the great minds in the world of computer science. He grew up in small-town Iowa and ended up founding one of the world's leading research institutions. At the University of Rochester in the late 1970s, where Rick got his postgraduate degrees, he was among the first to work with the Xerox Alto. The Alto was the first computer to use a graphical interface and a mouse, a full decade before the Apple Macintosh, and 2 decades before Windows 95 made it ubiquitous. Rick and his friend Gene Ball developed Alto Trek, likely the first computer game ever to run across a network of computers. Later, at Carnegie Mellon, Rick advanced many fields including artificial intelligence, networking, and programming languages. But his most famous work was the development of the Mach kernel that changed the way computer operating systems are built. If you use Apple products, whether a computer, tablet, or phone, the underlying code can trace its heritage back to the Mach kernel. Rick is, however, best known as the founding leader of Microsoft Research. The organization he created and led for over 20 years is consistently at the front edge of computer science. It's been instrumental in developing fascinating technologies in a range of areas, including speech and language, data management and exploration, and user interfaces. He is a passionate advocate for research and researchers.
I think sometimes in our society we forget how important it is that we have all those specialized bits of expertise, people that know how to do a really tiny thing really well.
In our conversation, Rick and I talked about his journey from small-town Iowa to the bleeding edge of computer science. He described how he built and managed a global research organization. We later explored the impact of research on the current pandemic. And that's what this is all about. This is Leading Smart, the show about managing in the brainpower age. It's a field guide to the joys and challenges of leading and working in the modern workplace. I'm Chris Williams, your guide to the stories and ideas that I hope will inspire you to be a better leader in the world of knowledge work. In this episode, I talk with the founding leader of Microsoft Research. This is episode 209. My conversation with Rick Rashid. Rick Rashid in many ways represents the best of the American dream. His grandparents escaped religious persecution in the Ottoman Empire in the late 1800s and settled in Iowa. From there, a passion for math and science landed him a spot at Stanford.
So always scientists. I love, tinkering, working on radios and TVs and doing science experiments. I was the president of the science club. I did all the usual science things.
Yeah. So how does a kid from middle Iowa end up at Stanford?
Almost completely by accident. The funny story there was that, I was looking to figure out, what universities I wanted to apply to. And my guidance counselor decided really on his own to put together an application for me for Stanford, which honestly, I didn't know anything about Stanford at the time. And he thought I should apply there. And so, I applied to University of Illinois where I was accepted and some other places. And so I wound up eventually getting accepted to Stanford. And I honestly didn't know where the heck it was. When I went to get a plane ticket to go there, it was like, oh, it's Northern California. I didn't know what part of California it was, right? Oh, I'm flying to San Francisco. That's interesting. So yeah, it was really kind of an accident. I mean, it was a great place. I really, enjoyed being there.
Rick had the fortune to meet Dan Ling on his first day at Stanford. Dan went on to work at IBM Research, where he advanced the state of the art in computer video and eventually followed Rick to Microsoft Research. It was Dan who introduced Rick to computers in his sophomore year.
I was a undergraduate major in mathematics and also in comparative literature. So I had a dual major, very weird dual major, not too many mathematics, comparative literature majors out there. And my good friend at Stanford, I'd met the very first day I was there, it was Dan Ling, who you eventually got to know. And I became a corporate vice president of Microsoft as well. And Dan had taken this computer science class. He was a electrical engineering major, but he took this computer science class. And it was like, wow, he loved it. He thought it was the greatest thing. And said, well, you've got to do this. It's so much fun. You should take this. And of course, I had a pretty full course load with 2 majors, but I said, okay, sure, why not? Add one more, what the heck? And it was I just loved it. It's one of these, love at first sight kind of things where it's like, this is a fabulous subject. And then I took the next class, which was an architecture class. We had these very early HP 2116 mini computers. We had 2 of them for the class. And they were in a special room that was locked. And you had to have a code to get in and everything. And you had to program this thing from the switches and from paper tape because that was the only way it worked, actually. There was no other way to program it. And for whatever reason, that just appealed to me. I remember the first I spent all day getting this program to work that would basically read in things from a paper tape, sort them, and print them back out again on a teletype. And I got that working, and I just floated across campus. It's like midnight, and I just floated up. I mean, it's like my intellect had animated this piece of machinery, right? It's like, how cool is that? That is the coolest thing I could think of. And so I got just really fascinated. I wound up taking pretty much every course Stanford had on computer science. There was no major at the time, right? This is before there was a major. So I just took a whole bunch of classes. And
Rick then got a chance to help start a computer science program at the University of Rochester in Upper New York State.
I was going to go to graduate school in mathematics, and I was accepted at Berkeley. And then I was contacted by Jerome Feldman, who was associate director of the AI lab at Stanford. And he had seen my resume and my information, from the program. And he was starting a new computer science department at the University of Rochester. And he didn't have his own admissions program or anything like that. So he was reached out to people he thought would be good students for him. And he convinced me that I didn't really want to go on to graduate school in mathematics. I really wanted to join him and do this new computer science program at Rochester.
Rochester was also the home of Xerox. On the strength of their massive copying machine empire, Xerox was funding a great deal of cutting-edge research, both in Rochester and in their famous Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, in California. Those connections helped land the new computer science department some state-of-the-art computers.
We were also able to arrange to get Xerox Altos, as a new startup department when nobody else outside of Xerox had them. And, that was just a tremendous advantage as a young, starting up your first year as a graduate student, and you get access to, the most powerful personal computer that anyone had ever created. And it was a unique resource for us.
After getting both a master's and a PhD at Rochester, Rick found his way through a happy accident to Carnegie Mellon University.
Well, that was also an accident. There were a lot of accents in my life, to be honest.
Well, actually, I've interviewed a lot of people, and there are accidents in every one of them. So,
Yeah, planning is definitely overrated, I think.
yes.
At least career planning.
Yeah.
But, in my case, what happened was I had not applied to CMU in any way. I was out interviewing in other universities and other research labs. But there was some sort of conference where Jerry Feldman, who is the guy who started the Department of Rochester and who's the person who brought me in, and Raj Reddy, who was one of the prominent professors at CMU, were at together, and there was some cocktail party, and Raj was asking Jerry if he had any really great system students that he could, bring in because they desperately needed, a strong system student for a new project that they were doing that was in the area of networking and personal computing. And Jerry said, "Well, you should talk to Rick Rashid." Raj literally called me up on the phone. I'd come back from a recruiting trip, and Raj called me up on the phone and said, I want you to come out here. I want you to talk to us. We need you here. And it wasn't so much of an interview as it was a sell trip. He totally made up his mind, I think, put on the full court sell and convinced me that I needed to go there and help start this project, that was called the Spice Project at CMU.
Did you join as an assistant professor or just as a research student or?
No, I joined as what they have a research scientist position, which they basically at CMU at that particular time, I assume it's probably the same now, but I don't know for a fact. But at the time they had both tenure track positions, which were the assistant professor, associate, and so on, and they had the equivalent research track positions. And the only real difference between the research track, research scientist track, senior scientist, and so forth, and the professor track was soft money versus hard money, right? So the professors were technically hard money, tenure track positions, and the research positions, were soft money, not tenure track. But the reality is, you did exactly the same thing, meaning I taught classes, I did everything and eventually they actually moved me over to the tenure track, and I got tenure there. But there was effectively no difference between the two, except for where the money came from.
Rick spent over a decade at CMU teaching and doing some seminal work in the area of computer operating systems. Rick and a team developed the Mach kernel, an operating system that forged all new ground and helped lay the foundation for many systems to follow. Then along comes Microsoft looking to start a research lab, and they knew how to get Rick's attention. They enlisted Gordon Bell, one of the most famous names in early computer science. Bell had been instrumental in the development of the minicomputer and led some of the most important developments, both at Digital Equipment Corporation and at Carnegie Mellon. It was a phone call Microsoft was sure Rick would answer.
Well, interesting enough, the first person that contacted me, it was by phone, was Gordon Bell. So Gordon had been asked by Nathan Myhrvold to help him, find a director for this new research lab that he had gotten approval from Bill and from the board of directors to create. And so I'm in my home in Pittsburgh, and it's dinner time, and I get this phone call. Now, you get phone calls at dinner time, right? They're not usually anything very interesting, but this is Gordon Bell, right? So, one of the more famous computer scientists in the world. You can't really tell Gordon, "Hey, I'm having dinner. Can you call back later?" So I assume this is why Nathan asked Gordon to do this, because again, you can't really tell Gordon that you're having dinner. So anyway, I talked with Gordon, and he convinced me to have him and Nathan come out to Carnegie Mellon to talk with me about this lab that they wanted to create. The honest truth is, I had very little reason to believe this was something I wanted to do. Right? It was Microsoft is a very small company. The record of companies starting research labs wasn't that great anyway, and small companies starting research labs was, generally speaking, an oxymoron. Right? It's just not. It doesn't make any sense. Right? Why would they want to do this? And Microsoft didn't exactly have a great reputation in the academic community. I mean, it was just a small software company doing DOS, as far as anybody knew. So
run by several college dropouts.
yeah, well, I didn't even know very much about Bill in those days. So so they come out and they try to convince me that this is a good idea, and they didn't get very far with that. But they have lots of enthusiasm, and they convinced me, well, you should at least come out and visit us.
So this is late 90, probably?
This is the summer of, this was the spring of 1991.
Okay.
Right. And so I go out to Microsoft, and the honest truth is I was very impressed with everybody I talked with. I talked with Jim Alchin. I mean, I talked with Nathan, of course, and I had a fabulous conversation with Bill, and I was just very impressed. I mean, these are very smart people, and they actually knew what they were doing, and they seemed to have a pretty good idea of what they wanted out of a research lab and why they would want to start one, and how they thought it would work. In particular, Bill, it was a funny conversation with him because I kept expecting that I would say something and he would contradict me, because obviously he couldn't possibly think about research and running a research lab the same way that I did. And yet everything he seemed to agree with everything. And he actually came back to me with a lot of things that made sense to me. And I came out of that meeting thinking, either one, Bill really does understand what building a world-class research lab would be like, or two, he just really wants to hire me. He's going to say yes to everything I said. Right. And Bill, he's actually not like that.
Right. Right.
If he disagrees with you, he doesn't actually.
Yeah. There's no hiding it, right?
You can't hide from Bill. So, but I learned that years later as I got to know him better. But at the time, I wasn't really sure. So I went back. I was very impressed with my visit, but I still turned Nathan down again because honestly, I just liked being at Carnegie Mellon. The university was also courting me at that time to be the dean of what was becoming the School of Computer Science, and they wanted me to be its first dean. And so I had this conflict going on, right? I was really happy doing what I was doing, and then all of a sudden I have people trying to get me to do something different, and I had a lot of loyalty to Carnegie Mellon, and I felt strongly about wanting to help the university. At the same time, I was intrigued by what I saw at Microsoft, and so it was a very interesting summer as I tried to contemplate what I should do. Nathan kept pushing on me. I kept pushing back. He would refer to me as Dr. No, because I kept telling him no. I think he thought maybe I was negotiating. I'm not sure. But it got to a point where I decided I was going to make a decision on a particular day and let Microsoft and Carnegie Mellon know on that day. It's the end of basically the beginning of September, end of August. And eventually I decided I would go to Microsoft. And I think a lot of that was just driven by my feeling that it was going to be more fun. It was going to be something I could start from scratch. And, in a way that was very daunting. And most of my friends thought I was crazy because they thought starting a research lab in this remote Pacific Northwest where nobody was, and and it was not a place you could imagine building a research lab back in those days. Basically, everybody thought if you're going to be doing a research lab back then, it needed to be Boston or or California, right? And Pacific Northwest was considered to be extremely remote, and it was going to be difficult to recruit. I mean, that's what everybody would tell me. But I guess I felt it was going to be a fun challenge, and so I took up that challenge and didn't really regret it.
I wondered how Rick, a university professor, could take on the challenge of starting a research institution from scratch. Had he done much leadership?
Technically, I was a full professor there, but I had a fairly large organization that I was running because the mock research project got to be pretty large, and with a lot of funding from DARPA, and also a number of companies were funding us. So it was one of these things where I had about a 30, 40 person organization, plus I was heavily involved in running the department in those days. So, um, you know, certainly brought in a lot of the money the department was run with in those days. So in a way, I had a lot of opportunity to understand what it was like to at least start and run a research project from scratch.
So when you got to Microsoft, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned and that obviously was clear to me, I came to Microsoft about a year later. One of the things that was just abundantly clear to me, and you brought it up, was that it was filled with really smart people. I mean, it was if you were a fan of smart people, it was a kid in a candy store. I mean, there were just smart people everywhere. Was that invigorating, intimidating? Was it competitive? Was it?
It was tremendously invigorating. I mean, it in some ways it was the best environment to start a research group in, because you could bring in candidates and you could have them talk to some of these people and they'd realize, wow, I didn't realize there were so many incredible smart people. And these were people doing products, right? A lot of times researchers, you grow up in an academic environment and you get a PhD and you tend to think, oh, the PhDs are the smart people. No, really, they're just a ton of incredible people in the product organizations, many of whom had PhDs, by the way, but also many of whom had PhDs in other subjects entirely, not computer science.
English literature, right?
English literature, physics was that was actually fairly common. And so it's one of these things where it was a great environment to work in, and then also those people, I think, often appreciated when you brought in a really smart person, in a research role. They would appreciate that too. They didn't think, oh gosh, this is some pointy-headed intellectual. They said, oh, okay, I've read his papers, right? Or I've read her papers. I know what she's doing, right? And that was that. I think that was great. I remember the first time we did a research review with Bill, and I kept trying to get the researchers to understand how much Bill would likely know about what they were doing, right? But I don't think they really got it until they were in that room doing the review, and they realized Bill probably knew more about a lot of the things related to their subject than they did.
And probably had read the work that they had done before they walked in the room, and right.
And their competitors' work, and everybody, basically they realized they were going to have to up their game in presentation from that point forward.
Right.
That I wasn't just kidding them, that this was an environment in which they were going to be intellectually challenged, and intellectually challenged not just by their academic peers, but by the people in the product organization. I think one of the things I remember people asking me was what was different between the academic experience and working at Microsoft. And I would always say just the speed and the intensity, right? I mean, everything was so much faster at Microsoft, and the intensity of the work was so much greater. And it's not like, again, the academic world has its own intensity as well, but the stakes were very high. I mean, it always felt like the future of the company was at stake, right? The future of the field was at stake, and everyone was working, at what I felt to be sort of, peak velocity in trying to get things done, and that was invigorating.
One of the challenges of doing research, whether at a company or a university, is getting the ideas and developments into the products, into the real world.
That was really part of that was the vision from the very beginning. I mean, the vision statement for research was, move the state of the art forward in the areas that we're working. So be at the state of the art in each area that we're working in. And the second part of that was, when it makes sense, move that into products as quickly as we possibly can. And Bill was on board with that. Nathan wanted to do that. And honestly, that was pretty much my career. I mean, if you look at my career, the things that I worked on, got moved into various people's products, fairly quickly. I think it's one of the characteristics of maybe the systems area that I worked in, is that you tended to work a lot with companies, and you tended to work, on things that actually got into products and got into use. And so that was part of the way I thought about my own work. And that's the way I thought about Microsoft Research.
Was that relationship with the product teams easy, good, hard?
I think it varies dramatically with the individual teams and the people. Everything's person to person. There is no sort of organization, right? When it's all about people who get to know people, who get to trust people. I would always talk about, research is a full contact sport, and by that I mean it's person to person, right? It's not something you do at a distance. And I think very early on there were some very specific situations where the product groups came to research to help solve problems or to deal with situations that they found themselves in, and we would step up. And my philosophy was, if the company needs something, I'll drop whatever I'm doing. Let's figure it out and let's solve it. And that was kind of an attitude that I felt that the research organization should take. If the company needs help to make something happen, we should just say, okay, what do we need? Roll up our sleeves. Let's work together. And we had a lot of times where we did that with product teams, and I think we earned credibility as a result of that. And I think when people see that you're willing to work side by side, and that you can work as late as they can, and you can eat as much pizza as they can, that's when trust develops.
Was there any kind of movement of people between research and products? I mean, there were, as you said, there were all these really smart people in the product groups. Did anybody move from one way to the other, or was there a fairly crisp line there?
No, it was a fluid line, intended to be fluid, in the sense that we had a number of researchers that would move to product teams to either to help solve a particular problem or to take their ideas. Sometimes they would stay within the research management structure, but physically reside over in the product organization. Other times they would just move into that structure. But I always gave everyone a golden ticket to come back, right? So part of making it easy for people to work in the product teams was making sure that they understood that when they were done doing that, they could come back to research and go back to doing what they'd been doing before that they loved. And I think it was this sense of they weren't, they could move, and it was okay, right? And they could come back, and it was going to be fine in their career. They were enhancing it. And I think that was a philosophy that I would exude. That was something I would tell people, and that this is the way I thought of it. And I think people believed it, or at least a number of them did, enough to do it.
Under Rick's leadership, Microsoft Research grew from a small Redmond-based group into a worldwide research organization.
Well, It's interesting because originally I was not sure we could do that. Um, you know, we started our lab in Redmond, and my feeling was that um, it was important to have people together. That we could get the synergies of people working together. At the same time, sort of gradually, as we established Redmond, right, as it got to the point where it was clear that we were successful. We were dominating conferences in the areas we were doing our research, and we got to be about 100 people. I think by 95, early 96, we were about 100 people, and so that was pretty good. That was a good size for a research lab. And Nathan Meervold, who I reported to, he always wanted to do research labs outside the United States. I was always opposed to it because I felt, gosh, this is just going to be a management headache. I'm not. It's going to dilute our focus. But we certainly reached a size where it started to make sense, and we had a unique opportunity to hire Roger Needham at the University of Cambridge. And Roger was being forced to retire because they have a forced retirement age there. And he didn't want to retire really. And, through his friends, Chuck Thacker and Butler Lamson and various other people made it be known that he was available. And so we decided to start a research lab in Cambridge. And it was the availability of Roger that allowed us to do that. And we got that started very nicely. I mean, Roger was tremendously talented and a great person to bring other people in. And we decided soon after that, well, we should just take the plunge and start a lab in China. And took us about a year and a half, I think, from the time we started the lab in Cambridge to do the lab in China. But again, we felt that was an opportunity to bring in a unique set of talent. And I think when you start expanding like that, it's really to capture talent,
right,
that you couldn't get any other way. Clearly there were tremendously bright young Chinese who we could attract in China that we couldn't bring to the United States. Similarly, there were people who didn't want to leave Europe, didn't want to leave England, and we could tap into that resource. And I think I learned over time how to manage that. In terms of obviously you need tremendously smart leaders in each group, but you also need to build an infrastructure where people communicate, where they interact remotely, right? It's not just about who's next to you, but it's sharing experiences, sending people back and forth, having people in other labs for periods of time, building a culture that is shared and similar across the different organizations, even though they're not inside the same, macro culture.
One of the challenges multiple locations introduces is communication. Building and retaining connections at a global distance is hard.
We did create a number of opportunities for people to come to Redmond, to do presentations, to interact with researchers, and of course, I would try to spend some time with them. I would go to China once a year, and spend a week there, getting to know people, going around, getting a chance to, and also just getting a chance to know China, going to different universities and different research labs there, and getting a chance to interact with people in that environment, in that society. But yes, you can't get to know everyone in a 1,500 person organization. That starts to become a little unwieldy. But what you can do, I think, is try to keep things informal, right? It can't just all be formal meetings. It can't just all be I'm interacting with you in a very set framework, where we're all, we all know what to expect before we start, and we don't learn that much by the time we're finished, right? I really like the the serendipitous interactions that occur when you just talk with people and interact with them. When I was a professor at Carnegie Mellon, I never really found having meetings with large numbers of people to be super productive. I mean, there are times when you have to do it. I mean, you're coordinating, right? There's an absolute requirement that you get a lot of people in a room in order to coordinate. Everybody has to hear the same voices at the same time. Most of the time, that's not the really productive way to make things work, is to get those people who need to be together and talk together, and to do it more often than not in informal situations where they're actually solving a problem, as opposed to just being there.
I think one of the things that strikes me in any interaction I've had with you, you have an upbeat, positive. You almost always have a smile on your face, as you do right at this moment. Do you think that changes the way the whole organization works? Do you think having a positive, upbeat, proactive perspective helps the whole organization?
Yeah, I personally I do. I mean, I think it's a force multiplier, right? Optimism helps to drive people to do things that they would otherwise not necessarily believe they could do, right? I mean, my joke about my own field of operating systems is that, unless you were a wild optimist, there's no way you would ever work in operating systems, because it's way too hard, it's way too complicated, and certainly when you're starting from scratch, the chances of success are close to zero. So why would you do that unless you were just like unrealistically optimistic, right? There is no reason. I mean, and I think similarly, in a research environment, there you need to be able to tackle problems that most other people don't think can be solved, because that's how you push the state of the art forward. So unless you were optimistic about your abilities to do that, the chances of you actually pushing that boundary are pretty small. And I think it's one of the things that I did when I was at in the latter days when I was running research was I pushed this initiative which I called the Impossible Things Initiative. And the idea is that we would take on a small number of things that people thought were just plain impossible, and just see. I mean, just throw our heads and bodies against that wall and see what would happen. And I remember one of the things I originally proposed in the memo that I wrote was speech recognition and translation. I said, what I want to be able to do is in my yearly trip to China, where I speak to thousands of students at various universities, I want to be able to talk and have my voice translated into Chinese automatically. And I felt that was an interesting challenge. And I remember sitting down with some people and having lunch, again, randomly, because this is part of random management, right? Sitting down and having lunch with a group that happened to be the speech group not long after that. And so I sat next to this guy who is a young speech researcher, and he was absolutely convinced I was just nuts, right? He said, you just don't understand, right? You're some operating systems guy. You don't understand. This is an incredibly hard problem. We've been working on this for 25 years. We're making very tiny amounts of incremental progress. And this isn't going to happen anytime soon. And I kept trying to convince him in his own area, right? And I knew honestly, I do know quite a bit about this particular area, but in any case, I tried to convince him, no, we can do this. And I kept saying, well, but we don't have to do it all. First off, I was just talking, we could just do me, right? You could just translate me. I can speak very clearly. I'm from Iowa, right? I can enunciate really well. I can speak slowly. I have all these speeches of mine recorded. You can use, I have all this data. It's all transcribed by Microsoft. you can learn from all that data, right? I was trying to make it sound as easy as I possibly could. And I don't think I really convinced him very much, but there were people in that group that got really excited about the challenge and who believed, well, hey, if the head of the organization believes we can do this, maybe we can. And he's willing to back us up and he's willing to fund us. So what the heck, you know? And and it turned out it worked. In 2012, I gave a speech in Tianjin in China, and part of my speech was automatically translated into my own voice in Chinese. And all done by computer and all done off the cuff, as I was standing on stage there. And that was a great moment.
So that brings me around to, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how you motivate researchers. How do you performance review a researcher? How do you decide if somebody's doing well or not doing well? How do you manage out a poor performer? How does that stuff work?
Well, top level research lab, in some sense, you have almost a bit of an advantage over what a product group might have or more conventional organization because you have an external measure, right? So your people, it's a little bit like a top level, a professional basketball or football or something like that. You're measured against your peers on an ongoing basis around the world, right? You're up against the very best. You're publishing papers, you're establishing a reputation, and either you succeed in doing that or you don't, but you don't have some internal metric that you worry about. This is an external one is can you get your papers published in the top conferences and journals? Can you get the level of recognition? Can you get the awards? Can you get your peers in your community to recognize you for your accomplishments? And that's how you measure people in a top level research organization. And it's a pretty straightforward external. I mean, there's no number associated with it per se, but it's pretty easy for both you and the researcher to know when they're succeeding and when they're not. And when they're not, you encourage them to find other things that they could be doing because they're not going to be successful in your organization. So and people can contribute in a lot of different ways. It isn't just a research organization isn't just about the very top researchers. There are other people that contribute in other ways that aren't the ones that necessarily are the ones that are publishing the most. We obviously have developers and other people within the organization that play an important role. But you have to have those very top researchers, or you're not going to be at the state of the art in your field. And those are measured externally, and you can just point to the success or the failure. You celebrate the successes, and you move on from the failures.
We then turn to the effect of the pandemic on the research working environment. In a way, the multiple locations of the research group paved the way for the post-pandemic world.
Yeah, I think for us at least, it was already happening. I mean, when your organization is spread around the world, and I think the product groups are beginning to see this too, because they were being spread around as well. You come to realize that there are really a lot of things you can do to manage projects, to keep people in touch, to maintain interactions. And the honest truth is we have really pretty good tools now by comparison. If you look back 20 years when we were trying to do this, when we were both much younger, you didn't have GitHub, right? You didn't have the online meeting tools, and you didn't have the instantaneous communication that we do now. And I think there is a big change in the quality of the tools, both to create software, to manage projects, to do research. I mean, researchers also now have online repositories. They share their work. They share their their knowledge, and not just in a single institution. They share them across institutions now in ways that didn't happen 20 years ago. And papers now that used to wait a year to get a paper published, now it's online instantaneously. You can just get a pointer to it, read it, comment on it, fix it, share data with that researcher that may help them or contradict what they were doing. In some sense, it accelerates science and accelerates the work that people are doing.
But does this mean researchers working from home?
Yeah, I think to some extent that's already happening.
Okay.
The pandemic is causing it to happen, but it was happening before. I mean, you were already having researchers that were working across organizations, whether within Microsoft or between universities, between companies. That was already happening. The extent to which you can talk about doing research in your house depends a bit on what you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're doing theoretical computer science, you can probably do that in your house.
Right.
You need access to computational resources, but luckily the cloud has really solved that problem for us. For other researchers in other fields, it gets to be more difficult. If I'm building something physical, I need access to physical equipment,
or a chemistry lab, or any of those sorts of things.
Yeah,
right.
Or a linear accelerator, or there are things that you can't quite put in your backyard,
right?
Because the HOA is probably not going to allow them. But at the same time, we're also getting better control remotely of equipment. So it isn't just about, can I, do I have to be physically present? These days I can run a telescope from anywhere in the world and get the results. I don't have to be at the top of a mountain in Hawaii, right? I can run experiments, at CERN. I don't have to be at CERN personally. Now we have to have technicians there. We have to have people there, and there are times when I need to have physical access to a piece of equipment in order to understand exactly what's going on with it. If I'm doing biological research, I may need physical access to tissue, to people, to medical facilities. That's probably not going to change immediately. On the other hand, we have doctors operating remotely now. So I think we're getting to a point where the promise of the digital revolution is getting to be fulfilled in a lot of ways, in sometimes ways we weren't necessarily expecting.
On a personal note, Rick has recently recovered from a battle with leukemia that nearly killed him. Twice. Not surprisingly, he credits research with a great deal of his recovery.
I was lucky in that my leukemia diagnosis happened just on the cusp of a lot of new research coming online. The combinations of monoclonal antibodies and targeted biologics have completely revolutionized cancer care, and really given a lot of people a lot of hope they wouldn't otherwise have. I mean, I would just be dead. I mean, I almost died twice last year as my cancer became acute, and
now you're trail running,
and now I'm back to trail running, and
yep.
I'm ahead of my all-time best pace. So
super.
So I think we're lucky in a way. A lot. I mean, this is part of the reason why we do research. It doesn't matter what area it's in, whether it's computer science or biology or medicine or physics. You do research to solve problems, that are going to happen. There were a lot of times when I was at Microsoft when various people in the product groups would wonder about something we were doing and say, well, we don't have that problem, right? Why are you doing this? I said, well, the chances are we will have this problem, and we want to have a solution for the time when we do. Basic research, whether it's for a company, whether it's for a country or for a society, for humanity as a whole, it's a form of an insurance policy, right? It's when when we have a pandemic like this, that we have researchers that can go out and solve those problems for us. They can develop those vaccines at a pace that have never been seen before. That can come up with new drugs on an accelerated schedule, and who can save lives. It's always you feel badly about the fact that so many people have died in this particular pandemic, but you have to feel incredibly great that only that many people have died, right? That if you look at past pandemics, by this stage in the pandemic, it would have been tens or hundreds of millions dead.
And we're looking at a number of vaccine candidates 6 months or 8 months out from the start of the pandemic, as opposed to 3 to 5 years out, which is what it would have been just a few years ago. And the genetics research and those kinds of things have laid the foundation for that.
Well, and these new RNA vaccines are an example of a completely new area of vaccine research. It started with some of the work on Ebola and SARS, but now there's a possibility those could be some of the very first vaccines that come online, and they could revolutionize the way we think about vaccination. So I'm both a living example, but also, it's been my life's work to invest in doing basic research well ahead of when we necessarily had to have it, and being ready with solutions to problems when they actually occur. And so many times, during my time at Microsoft, when the product groups needed something, we would have already done research on it. We would have the best people in the world that knew about it, and we could put those people and treasure chest of ideas and technologies to work, to solve the problem for those product teams. I think that's what we're doing now for this pandemic.
Rick Rashid is both a personal and professional example of the best of pure research and the value it brings to the world. I can't thank him enough for both the decades of work he has done and for spending the time with me. Leading Smart is from me, Chris Williams. You can find out more about the show and discover other resources for leaders at my website, clwill.com. If you like the show, please share it with your friends, especially on social media. Referrals are the greatest source of new listeners. I'd also love your feedback. I'm the CL Will on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Or send an email to pod@clwill.com. That's it for this episode. The next episode, we return to the studio and to the topic of diversity. We'll talk about how to actually build an organization that thinks different. It's called It's About Time. I hope you'll listen. Until then, please remember that each of the several dozen decisions you make today are part of Leading Smart.